Hi everyone, it's Kevin Annett. Well, as you may or may not know, you know now, I published my 16th book called The Border, a post-Canadian anthology, written as more biographical reflection and also a selection of my sermons, lectures, various public talks over the years, written hopefully from a more humorous, because what can you do but view tragedy with its flip side, humor. I'm going to start with something I call parting shots. Why do primates kill their own kind? A Christmas epistle to Anglican primate Fred Hiltz, written in the year 2015. This is quite appropriate since Mr. Hiltz, who helped cover up the genocide at the Anglican Mohawk School in Brantford, Ontario, this was a letter written to him personally in the course of all of that. Dear Primate Fred, you probably have never heard of Crazy Walter, even though he collapsed the pomp and dignity of one of your predecessors on a memorable spring day in 1990 at the Vancouver seminary I attended. Walter was someone as unacceptable as Jesus in action. He dropped out of the Vancouver School of Theology, or VST, to enter a higher calling and career of random street corner preaching in Toronto, engaging in the kind of ecstatic joy so unfamiliar to the Church of England. As for a primate what's-his-name who Walt accosted, the sorry bastard is long since retired to wherever it is its simians end up. But the memory of their brief encounter is forever pristine. Walt was a bearded wild man who hung around our seminary and sometimes even attended classes, although the profs all hated him because he knew so much. But everyone tolerated him with such apparent liberality because they were all too scared to ask him to leave. I liked the guy because of how he made all of the pious bunnies run for cover. So, on the memorable morning in question, Walt was trying to liven up the place, as was his wont, since the sight of all of us oh-so-serious aspiring clerics tended to piss the guy off royally. His intense blue eyes jabbed at us unmercifully as he expounded the truth of what the Bible really meant, usually waving his arms and employing suggestive hip thrusts and touches of ribaldry that made the more devout students blush and look away. "I'm here to skewer you ungrateful little bastards with the word," he had exclaimed that morning, to the scowls of those of my church colleagues who had never met a real live prophet before. Walt was on a roll that day, and my buddy Rich Lang and I were close to nervous exhaustion for having laughed our guts out. Then, suddenly, an announcement was made that sounded like the heralding of the second coming. A fervent young woman student exclaimed, "The Anglican primate is here!" The room went quiet for a moment, and then like a pilgrim on the verge of a sacred orgasm, Walter's eyes sparkled and he shouted out gleefully, "The fucking primate?" Without another word, Crazy Walter leapt up and hurried to the doorway and deliberately thrust his ass in the direction of the potentate, who had just entered the main hallway of VST. Walt then began to slowly rotate his considerable buns in the direction of his fellow primate and emit the kind of sounds that undoubtedly make it happen for your average baboon in rut. "It's the primate!" Walt shouted and sang gleefully, "The fucking primate!" Rich and I collapsed on the floor, screeching and gasping for air. Through tears of laughter, I caught Walter jumping up and down in the hallway, his ass still offered to the churchmen as the Anglican primate's shocked entourage stood bewildered and gaping. The church groupies were too stupid to even be embarrassed. Well, being Canadians, none of them said anything, of course. His primateness gave Walter a rather strange look. And then without a word, as if his mocker was not even there, Monkey Man and his church mob shuffled off for a sumptuous feast and booze fest somewhere in the building. By the time Crazy Walter returned to us in triumph, the majority of our career-conscious fellow students had scattered in terror. Walt beamed with avuncular pride at Rich and me for staying, throwing his weary and sizable buns down on the couch, and he announced, "Sorry guys, it was all that purple the fucker wore. Made me randy as hell." I realized now that Walter was saying and knew more than he was actually letting on. Now, Fred, Mr. Hiltz, I know that the topic of anal intercourse must make you nervous, being a head churchman and all, but bear with me for a minute. Let me try to lubricate the topic, with a theological reference to make the impact a little bit gentler. Let's start with someone that you Anglicans tend to avoid as much as they do guys like Walter, and that's Jesus himself. Someone who, as you know, got strung up for pissing off top churchmen like you, Fred. After all, Jesus' prescription for child rapists was to tie a 10-ton grinding stone around their neck and throw them into the nearest ocean, presumably with lots of loving and forgiving nonviolence. So we know where that leaves you guys and those whom you protect. Shit out of luck, as Walt would have said. What is the Anglican Church's punishment for raping a child, Fred? Forget it, I already know the answer. It's nothing. Like your colleagues, the Papists, you call the destruction of a child a forgivable sin. Canadian law requires only a wrist-slapping 1-year mandatory sentence in jail for child rape. So it's not as if you're under any pressure to go hard on the sickos and killers in your midst, even when they flogged to death and raped to death their little victims and buried them in shallow graves, like the one we excavated, or tried to excavate, at your church's Brantford Indian Residential School. Well, besides my sheer delight in recounting the tale of not-so-crazy Walter, what's causing me to drop you this little note is a lie you tried passing off recently when you said that you have no power to order the release of documents held by your bishop, Bob Bennett, concerning kids who died at the Mohawk Indian Residential School in Brantford. Now that's an odd thing for you to say, Fred, because hell boy, you're the fucking primate. The buck stops with you, especially since you speak on behalf of that tottering old woman who my Irish family members like to call that bitch in Buckingham Palace. That means you not only get to wear all sorts of sexy purple outfits, Fred, but you can tell any Anglican priest or a Bishop Bob precisely what to do. Unless I missed something about your ecclesiastical hierarchy. So, your big lie got me wondering, why would the top Anglican in Canada want to conceal documents concerning the Mohawk Indian Residential School? Well, one doesn't need much gray matter to figure that one out, which is frankly what makes you and the whole situation laughable, because you all know the score, but you pretend not to. You won't even let on the fact that you ordered Leona Moses, a researcher with your church, to be quiet on pain of jail or worse, I think were your words. Frankly, the bloodstains from those legions of dead children are all over your Anglican church, Fred, even after all the official scrubbing and whitewashing. So come clean, Mishkin. You know that you've sealed away documents that prove your church and the British Crown intended and tried to eradicate the Mohawk Nation. You know about the bones we uncovered at the Brantford School that on forensic analysis turned out to be that of a human, a little girl about 5 years old. Like I told your co-conspirator, Bishop Bob Bennett, the graves are opening now and your lies don't work anymore. So, let me remind you of something that you may not know or may have forgotten along the journey to grasp your Archbishop's mitre. Since the truth always comes out, all of the king's horses' asses cannot keep even the biggest lie enthroned forever, Fred. And that's bad news not only for you, but for your boss, Lizzie Britt, and her pack of inbred, moronic, child-killing family members. You know, Fred, history shows us time and again that in the final days of a dying regime like yours, the decisions of the people at the top, so-called, always become more and more self-destructive, irrational, and just plain stupid. That's why the abomination called your church may only be summed up with a simple gesture, and that is to be laughed at. All we can do is laugh and mock you, like Walter and Jesus did so well. So relax, numbnuts. Nothing's in your hands anymore. The great wheel of destiny is turning, and those with eyes to see and hearts to feel will know where they belong now. And that's not in your ranks. But one final point, and let's end on a humorous note. I hear that after getting rid of some of the most incriminating Mohawk school documents, they don't call him the Shredder in Huron Diocese for nothing, your Bishop Bob Bennett tried the usual distraction ploy by announcing, guess what, a new policy in his diocese. And you gotta love those quaint old Roman terms, diocese. Anyway, in the Huron Diocese now, according to Bishop Bob Bennett, henceforth, no Anglican clergyman can drive alone in a car with a child anymore. I kid you not. I'd call that an admission of guilt, wouldn't you? Well, you got to hand it to the crazies. They only keep getting crazier. Anyway, Merry Christmas, Mr. Primate. Now go eat a banana. Well, Fred, I hope you get that. And we will be seeing you outside your Anglican conference between July 10th and 16th, where, among other things, people will be trying to enforce the standing arrest warrant against you for concealing crimes against humanity and possibly even being complicit in the death of Leona Moses and others. Well, enough of Fred. Here's the second thing I want to read you from the Border, and it's entitled, So What Do You Believe Anyway, Kev? Well, George Leong was a logger in my Port Alberni congregation. He hated environmentalists and he kept his kids away from Indians. He also didn't like my sermons. You never tell us what to believe, Kev, he complained to me one Sunday during after-church coffee. Is that my job? I replied Socratically. Well, you're the minister after all, George exclaimed desperately. If you don't know about God, then who does? Well, it's funny because people stopped asking me about God years ago. I guess the consensus was that once I was officially defrocked from the United Church of Canada, that somehow disqualified me from membership in the God expert fraternity. But recently that's changed, perhaps because of the success I've had in combating religious group crime. The formerly unspoken question is now being asked of me, what do I think of Jesus anyway? Well, listen up. This is taken from a mini sermon I gave once called Table Talk Number 3. What is this thing called the Jubilee? Doing more than preaching. And it's based on Leviticus chapter 25 and Luke chapter 4, verses 14 to 21. I was 4 years old when I first helped myself to the bread out of the baker's truck. My mother, always hawk-eyed when it came to yours truly, spotted my deed and confronted me as I calmly sat munching my prize on the sidewalk outside our home. I was hungry, I explained when Mom asked me why I had taken the bread. I had no idea why something so obvious needed an explanation. Nor did I understand her attempt to explain the strange concept of money to me. Well, my mother perhaps blamed this early formative moment for my tendency to give away anything in our house that wasn't nailed down to those people who needed it more than we did. Cutlery, food, toys, clothing, even Mom's favorite fondue set ended up in the hands of the local needy families. Mom started locking up everything. And just imagine, back then I hadn't even started reading the Bible. My egalitarian streak only intensified when I had scripture revealed to me in United Church Sunday School. There it was in black and white, something that I knew at a gut level. God gave creation to all of us. No mention of rich and poor or debt consolidation loans back in Eden. And even better, not much later in the biblical timeline, the wandering Jews were told by Jehovah that every 50 years they had to pull a Kevin Annett and give away what they had to the needy. Land was to be returned to its original owners, debts were to be canceled, and all the prison cells opened up and prisoners set free. God called this the Jubilee year. Well, like all good ideas and divine commands, the Jubilee was never put into practice by we sloppy mortals. Indeed, something else happened. Instead, the recipients of the Jubilee laws, the tribal Hebrews, demanded a king to rule over them and war chariots and other weapons of mass destruction to smash those nasty Canaanites into dust. And for some odd reason, the big shot kings of Israel conveniently forgot about the world turned upside down Jubilee commands given to them by the Almighty One they supposedly were worshiping. Well, that's okay, folks, don't despair. A few centuries later, in a one-camel dump called Nazareth, there appeared a local yokel named Yeshua ben Yosef, who had the temerity to take the law into his own hands. One morning in the synagogue, amid the usual chanting and gossiping and snoring, Yeshua stood up uninvited and announced the following. Okay, everybody, I've got news for you. The Jubilee's arrived. Not in 50 years, not after you've had lunch, but right now, at this very moment, right here. So say farewell to collecting on all those debts. The prison doors just got flung open. No more land grabbing or interest rates or rich and poor. That's all gone now, folks. We're living under a new regime called the Kingdom of Heaven, so rejoice. Well, they didn't rejoice. As a matter of fact, the good friends and neighbors of this rabble-rouser grabbed him and tried to kill him by throwing him off a cliff. But killing him had to wait a few more years to succeed. Meanwhile, Yeshua, the shit disturber, otherwise known by his Greek name Jesus, walked about the land establishing a new society. And when he went beyond words and tried getting rid of the biggest barrier to God's Jubilee revolution, and that was the money-soaked and militarized temple in Jerusalem, well, you know what happened to him next. And that same fate of crucifixion has befallen all the other poor people in history like Yeshua who have ever tried to do as he did and as God commands and reclaim the world for themselves and for all of the people. When I think back to my young self eating freely and unafraid from the earth's bounty and sharing what I had with others automatically, I'm struck by how inborn and self-evident is the Jubilee spirit within humanity. From each according to their abilities, to each according to his needs. It's that simple. Because the world was made a common garden without barriers, and society would operate exactly that same way, and there wouldn't be suffering and starvation if society reflected the mind of God. But since it doesn't, and instead is ruled and torn apart by the satanic force of greed, of property, of war and class divisions, the Jubilee spirit sweeps in to overturn and return humanity to its source in the natural law. Because once our people moved according to the earth's rhythms and nature's rhythms, we understood innately that society, like nature, has to routinely rest and lie fallow in order to recover and to replenish itself. Inequality and oppression have to withdraw and stand down or be stood down so that natural justice can reassert itself and restore life to everyone. Jubilee wipes the slate clean so that humanity can recover from itself. That's all that Jesus was trying to do. That's all he was trying to demonstrate by his life. But we have fallen away from him and his lesson and from the revolution that he embodied, God's revolution. A crushing wall of might makes right blocks out such liberation. And so a divine blast of change collapses and clears away all of the barriers to God's plan. That's indeed the meaning of Jubilee. It comes from the Hebrew word yobel, which means a trumpet blast, the kind that announces a great event or the arrival of something new. In the book of Leviticus, the people are instructed to hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty in the land to all of the inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee unto you. Leviticus 25:10. This very saying is inscribed in the American Liberty Bell in Philadelphia and served as the basis of a true republic under God. The fact that heaven ordains and trumpets justice and equality for all people every second generation, every 50 years. Well, Thomas Jefferson went even further than that, and he declared that in order to survive, the American Republic needed a revolution every 20 years. That's, in short, every new generation. In other words, the Republic, like the earth and its people, has to recreate itself with each new generation, recreate itself continually or die. And we've got a lot of evidence to confirm that all around us. The divine plan is for all people to return to a level and equal footing with each other routinely. But of course, every ruling elite in history, whether political, financial, or religious, desires and works for the opposite and hates that equality, considers God's equality impractical and subversive, and calls it all sorts of nasty names. Well, because for many centuries, official Christianity has disregarded the Jubilee Revolution and has sided with the rich rulers of this world, that revolution of equality has been voiced not by God talkers, but historically by the bearers of so-called atheistic creeds, like rationalism, socialism, communism. But the truth remains whoever speaks it, and must move from thin words to thick action for it to be real and for it to become life-giving. If Jesus is actually present among us, he can only be known through a visible social arrangement, a new covenant in which free men and women establish the Jubilee equality and renewal in their daily affairs. True faith in Jesus' message must be elevated to a social reality and not be reduced to a dead religious ritual or creed or religion. Jesus demonstrated this literally by setting captives free, returning land to landless peasants, and canceling the debts of any of those people who joined his Jubilee movement. Like any guerrilla leader, he established liberated zones, first in the mines and then in the surroundings of the people, in the land around them. And in that way, he overturned and began to replace the status quo. And that's the only reason he was judicially murdered. Not because he proclaimed himself to be God, the Son of God, because in his time and place in the Roman Empire, crucifixion was reserved solely for political insurrectionists and armed rebels. It wasn't used to kill religious heretics. Stoning was. Today we find the same struggle play itself out whenever people try to make Jesus' way a living reality in our world. The Jubilee vision is a keg of dynamite being deliberately contained within religion. But I know from having tried to make it real and put it into practice that when we unleash that dynamite and bring poor and rich together and abolish the differences between them and raise up that new society, the full weight of church and state falls upon us and tries to crush us like it did Jesus, as he predicted it would. But the Jubilee Revolution is as necessary now. Its laws are as revolutionary and as much of a threat to the status quo now as they were 2,000 years ago, especially a threat to bankers, to bishops, and to heads of state. And so the vision and the purpose remains, beginning by personally sharing out the wealth of the world, and especially the wealth of the Christian churches, with those who have nothing. For here is the unending challenge. Will we do more than proclaim this word, but actually enact it among ourselves as the equal and freeborn men and women that we are and are meant to be? This is Kevin Ann, 8 Strong Voice. MurderByDecree.com.